Woohoo! We did it. We're live, everybody. Welcome to Tanzu Tuesdays. I got my fancy pants new background going, which I'm excited about. And we got our little avatar of our speaker. Oh man, we are living the dream. Welcome, thank you. How is everyone doing? Hi. Let's do a
Hi,
check-in. Let's do a
let's do a
check-in.
check-in.
Yeah, Paul,
Hi.
how are you? Tiffany, hi.
I'm doing amazing. It's such a great time to be alive.
Couldn't
Living
agree
the
with you
dream.
more. Yep, that's right.
Living
Thank
a
you.
dream, not the dream,
Yes.
but a dream.
Right. Just a dream, a
Yeah.
random dream,
Nightmares are
or a nightmare.
dreams, good
Right.
dreams. They're all dreams.
Right.
It's a
Exactly.
dream. Tiffany, how are you?
Good. Tired, but good. Speaking of dreams, horrible dreams, but
Oh, yes. Yes. I find both my wife and I have agreed that we're just not sleeping well. Like there's no real
No.
reasons. We're like we'll get some exercise. Obviously we have kids, so those keep us busy. There's all the reasons to fall asleep at night, but we just are having a hard time. So
Yeah, I have the
yeah.
same problem. I'll eat like a triple cheeseburger, and then I'll for some unknown reason I'll just sweat all night. I don't know why.
with a
Maybe
little
skip the
indigestion,
dessert
maybe.
ribs.
I don't know why. Maybe I'll skip the dessert ribs. That's
Yeah.
definitely the
That's
problem.
that's the key.
Yeah.
That's the key.
Let me formally introduce our presenter today. It's the fabulous my work husband Nate Schutta,
Hello,
Nathaniel
friend.
Schutta, as his name says on the bottom of the Zoom. But yes, hello, sir.
Hello. Hello. Good to see
You-
you as well.
You're coming to us live from.
I am based out of the great state of Minnesota, and so it's a rainy day here in
Oh,
Minnesota, but the temperatures are above freezing, so we're pretty happy.
right. Can you give us the Brad Pitt weather check?
Weather check. Yeah.
Yep,
Yep.
pretty good.
Yep. Pretty good. Pretty good. Pretty good.
So when was the last time it snowed? Because you had some April snow, right?
Yeah, I mean a little bit. It this time of year, if it happens, it basically collects on the grass and then it melts and you don't really think twice about it. Although it's always funny when you have that neighbor that runs all the fuel out of their snowblower and you're like, "Whoa, friend, I don't know if it's quite ready for that." That's like getting your car washed and then it rains the next day. It's the same exact thing.
Mm-hmm.
I always think I tell people they can thank me because usually when I wash my car, it will then rain, and I go, "Yep, you're
Right.
welcome. I did that. You're
That's
welcome."
on me. That's on
Yeah.
me.
You're a good man. You're a good man.
Well, living in the great state of California, we're always in a
Rain.
drought, so we need the
True.
rain every day.
Well, I'll give you some of my Seattle rain if I could.
Is that possible? It's like when you tell a parent who's about to become a parent, like, "Hey, save up on that sleep." It's like, "Hey,
Right.
send some of that rain down here." It's like these are
I
all
don't,
impossibilities,
I
but
don't know. I went to California multiple times and it rained and hadn't for a while. And one of the times it was raining so hard that it was flooding, and we took an Uber a few blocks to get to a restaurant.
Checks out.
well, then we definitely need you to come back. If you are the rain maker, then we need you to come back, please.
It'll be a
For,
while.
for what it's worth, I
That's
was
right.
in San Diego and it rained once. I
Me
think it
too.
was the
Also
day it rained in
flooding.
San Diego.
It was raining so hard. It like also flooding and running across the street with luggage to get to the Uber was just not fun.
Now, was this at CubeCon San Diego?
No, this was uh like work meeting
Oh,
thing.
okay.
I
Because
think KubeCon San Diego, didn't they have a heat
it rained.
wave and they had like
Oof.
a citywide power outage for like 3 days?
Well, it also rained, is what I was
Oh,
referring
okay.
to, because she was there.
Right.
But by the way, I got my Tanzu shirt
Yeah,
at
you
that
do.
event.
You fancy.
Shout out to the Tanzu booth at CubeCon San Diego. Woot woot! I know we've got some avid Tanzu booth people watching this right now. I hope we do.
It's all the
Anyway,
booth buddies. What can I say?
that's true. That's true. Yep, back when we were all booth pals. We got some people online. Hey, howdy y'all. Brian, back for more. Who's Sweet Killer 9? Do we know Sweet Killer 9? Is this a repeat?
Sweet
Good
Killer
day to you,
9. I don't
Sweet
think we
Killer
do.
9. You know what? I'm thinking of Sweet Killer 7. And so
Oh,
that's,
totally
yeah,
different.
Oh, yeah,
this is
Totally
Sweet Killer
different.
9. Totally different. Totally. Uh, and so, anyway, yes, Nate, what are we going to be talking about today? What do you
We're
want
going
to
to be talking
share with
about
us?
architecture, how to think architecturally, perhaps. Talk a bit about fitness functions. We'll just see where the day takes us.
Oh, we're going to
Sounds
build
like
stuff and we're
fun.
going to get in shape. I love it. Get in
Yeah,
shape.
sure. Yeah. Well, now that you've taught me about this, the chirp, I feel like
Oh,
I need to
yeah.
get my hands on a chirp.
Yeah, those
I don't
chirps
know
are
what that
pretty
is.
pretty game changers. Um, Oh,
I have to say, and I realize we're in the middle of pandemic time, but I'm a little surprised at how hard it is to get your hands on not just like yeast and toilet paper,
mm.
but things like a chirp. I went to Amazon and like, yeah, no, we're sold out. We don't know when we're getting anything back. And there's, I've been trying to get my hands on like some additional stuff for around the home gym, and
So that's the thing,
everything's sold out.
right?
So
Because
what is
everybody's
a
at
chirp?
home.
I have to explain what a chirp is.
Oh, chirp
Good
is
point.
I was wondering too.
it's 3 concentric circles that basically help to stretch your back out. What I enjoy is it cracks your spine a little bit. Like it's a circle that you put on the ground and then you lay on top of it, and then you can kind of like stretch out your back, and it helps to.
It's very similar to what Homer invented to crack his back when it had the garbage can that he used.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
I was
same
thinking
concept.
the Greek playwright Homer, but then you went.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, I went a very, very different direction.
I'm like, wouldn't that just be a rock? Wouldn't
Probably.
back in the Grecian days just be a rock? Anyway, so those foam rollers, Paul?
Yeah,
foam rollers.
I do know those foam rollers.
It's in the same family as that, but it's a lot more
Bigger.
concentrated and
Bigger.
So, yeah, the circles are bigger. Anyway, so.
The diameter or something. I think there's some kind of a circular term, and
We've
not just
now
the times the
officially
flat
given
disc.
Chirp way too much face time.
Way too much.
Yeah.
Are they a sponsor? Are they sponsoring?
I think we can get them to posthumously sponsor us.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, Java Grunt's going to be a foam roller. I mean, that guy's a triathlete, so
Wow.
he's rolling it out.
Does that mean does he try to be an athlete, but he never quite succeeded? Is that what that means?
Triathlete, you got that right.
All right.
Nice. I have a foam roller in the other room if anybody wants to use it. But well, I guess
I don't think it works that way. It won't fit through the camera or something.
I can't get it through the Zoom hole.
Anywho, I thought before we started, we might
Yes.
have a
Yes.
quick look at something.
Please.
Let me hit this button. Hopefully now you see my web browser. So I just wanted to quickly talk about our friends of the show, TGIK, or Thank God It's Kubernetes. An amazingly funny pun, obviously. So they have a show at Friday at 1 p.m. They actually live stream to YouTube because they are not down with the cool kids like we are on the Twitches.
Oh,
Yeah.
sick burn, bro. Sick
I
burn.
know. But they have a weekly show, and they have, believe it or not, 115 episodes with
Wow.
the 116th to go.
Holy.
This
Now I
Friday.
have episode envy.
Right? Well, we're at episode 4, so we
Four
got
Nan.
only 112 to go,
Four.
and then we'll be all caught up.
Yep. If they stop right now. Right. Got it.
Yeah.
Or if we do multiple a day.
In 2 days, if you Google them, you can hit this button, set reminder, and that will, I don't know, Google will like yell and scream at you when that time comes up.
Thanks, Google.
And they're going to be, I guess, Brian Lyles would be on, who's kind of a big deal. And he'll be talking about deploying applications, which
His Kubernetes smell
if
like rich
you're-
mahogany.
if you are using Kubernetes, you're probably going to be wanting to deploy applications. So this will probably help you. And with that, let's switch back to us. Well, there's Bob. I see you, Bob. How's it going?
Hey. Well, also, we just also want to give a quick shout out to Springboard Platform. Again, announced last week. It's going virtual. It's September 1st. If you want to, I believe we're still accepting paper calls for
I
submission.
believe the CFP is still open.
Yep. So head on over, look up Spring One Platform, and again, it is a virtual. So, I touched my face. Dang it, face toucher. Not in these times. Don't touch your face in these times.
I think it's
Bob.
okay if you're in your own home,
Oh.
touching your own face, right?
As long as you never left and didn't have anything new come in the house.
Sure.
You mean like ever?
Ever you're
Pretty
stuck.
much.
Now,
No,
we
I've
are
watched-
not
I've watched
doctors, so do not take our
Not at all.
advice when it comes to this kind
not
of thing.
close. Yeah. But we know doctors, and it's all about who you know.
Yeah, we could get
We don't need.
Dr. Sayer on, and he could tell us.
Yes.
Dr. David
He's a
Sayer.
good doctor.
Yes.
Now, he's a totally different kind of doctor, but I still
Completely
feel
different.
like I could take medical advice from him.
Well, and he's British, so he just sounds so
It
official
sounds
as well.
good.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
what a sweet
to
guy.
me, it just sounds like my colonial oppressors.
Oh, sure.
Oh.
Sick
Yeah.
burn against the motherland. All right. Well, I think without further ado, let's go. Let's have Nate. We brought you all this way, Nate. You
Well,
spent the time. You
yes, I
put a
came all
shirt
the way to
on.
my home office.
Yes.
Yeah, I got dressed. I mean, right. It's been a tough day. Been a
We
long
might
day.
as well just have some fun. So, anything else we need to say, Tiffany or Paul, before we get it going?
I'm just
Not that I can think of.
excited to see if I see there's a cat tower behind Nate, and if we do
Ooh.
not see a cat jump up on that tower,
Oh, yeah. Should we do like
at
an over
some
under?
point I will be upset.
Yeah,
So
what is the over under on one of my cats deciding to be part of this today?
Yeah, it's 112 Pacific right now. So like
Okay.
after 145, before or after 145.
Right, you got to declare a time frame.
All right.
So
Well, in the
before or
chat,
after that time.
everybody declares a time frame, and
all
then
right,
Paul has nominated himself to watch that cat tower the whole time.
absolutely,
Checks out.
that's my
Checks
job.
out.
All right,
Yeah,
let's switch across. So Nate, we have a test for you, and that test
Okay.
is: Are you capable of sharing your desktop in Zoom?
I mean, maybe if I remember how many times I have to actually hit the share button before it
And while you're
decides
doing
to-
it, I have one last
Whoa.
question. I've asked this question to all of our teams so far because we're all world travelers. I think I already know the answer as I've stated.
If you were a
it.
fruit, what kind of fruit would you be?
If you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be right now?
Oh, that's right.
Yes.
It's a good question. Well, I was supposed to be in Paris not too long ago, but frankly, I think you know where I'd go,
I
Bob.
know where you go. Yeah.
I'd go to London
Yep.
just so I could have dinner at my favorite restaurant.
You know, they
So-
do have McDonald's outside of London.
They do.
It's
Check
so
it.
much better there.
I didn't know that
better in
until
Europe.
just
Oh, well,
recently.
I guess London's not Europe anymore, but
So as an aside, Bob, you'll appreciate this. Back before, when we were allowed to leave our house, which was like
Mhm.
15 or 20 years ago,
Yes.
Christine and I would go on Saturday mornings to do spin up at the local Y. And one of these sort of, I don't know, icebreakery questions our spin instructor liked to throw out at people was turn to the person next to you and say what your favorite restaurant is.
Mhm.
And so normally I'm right next to my wife. And so, we don't really spend too much time on that because we all know the answers. But I was next to one guy who really wanted to engage. And so he said, well, what's your favorite restaurant? And I said, Core. And he just kind of looked at me, where's that? And I said, oh, it's in London. And he didn't ask me any more questions after
No,
that.
yeah, you kind of you
Got
jumped
right
the
out of
shark on
that.
that one. Yeah.
Totally jumped. It's like if you don't want to mow the lawn, break the lawnmower. That's
Yep.
what I did when I was about 14 years old. Haven't mowed a lawn since, basically.
yeah.
So, just saying, there's
And
a lot
he
of
just
ways.
thought you meant engage your core, and so he was like,
Right.
"Fine, I will, guys. Stop."
Right, exactly. So it's good times.
how to
Good
shut
times.
down conversations 101.
Yes.
Oh boy!
Yes.
I guess the peasants are revolting in chat,
Sure.
and so
Uh-oh.
we'd better actually just roll on. And Nate, should we kick it off?
Okay. All right. Well, there we go then. So on the off chance that you're actually interested in what I'm talking about, which I'm guessing you are, you wouldn't have bothered to hop onto Twitch here. Instead of me actually playing through Jedi Fallen Order, which was something that I did lob out as an option, Bob and Paul said, no, talk about something architectural. But I do have this written down in prose format, so you can grab this from us if you are so inclined. It turns out this architecting thing is a lot harder than what I thought it was going to be when I was young, naive developer person. And I guess I knew this in sort of the back of my head, but I didn't really realize it until I fully became an architect. And you run into the fact that there's competing agendas and technology changes all the bloody time. And frankly, this is a feature, not a bug. It's one of the things I love about this industry. It's what keeps things interesting. And so one of the challenges we face, whether you're an architect or not, whether you're just a senior engineer, principal engineer, whatever your title is, we don't want to be on a legacy platform. Nobody wants to be the last person on that legacy thing, but we don't want to change things every few months either. If we're not careful, we end up where one of my students, so she came to me one day and said, my app has 4 different UI frameworks baked into it. Now, I completely understand how this happened. Developers just kept chasing the new hotness. They're just like, oh, hey, here's something new and exciting I read about on Twitter this morning. And so we have to be very careful about that. We absolutely need to know how to evaluate new technologies. I wish I could tell you what was coming next. I wish I had this crystal ball, this ability to predict the future. No one does. There is one thing I feel very comfortable with, however, and there's one thing that I'm actually willing to go so far as to say I guarantee this. the technologies we use in 5 years are going to be different than what we use today. Now, there'll be echoes of the past for sure, but I'm pretty confident that 5 or 10 years from now, we'll be using things that haven't even been invented yet. Now, this is a very common thing in our industry. It's part of being a software engineer. We have to play with new toys. And, again, I don't think this is a particularly brilliant statement. I think anybody that's been in our industry more than about 15 minutes understands the reality that technology will change. It changes all the time. This is just the nature of the beast. And I didn't really appreciate this when I was just starting my career. I'd missed some technology wave or another. It does not matter which one it was. I thought, oh no, that was my one chance to get in on the ground floor. And I now realize how naive I was, that the reality is new technologies come along every 15 minutes. They're kind of like a bus that way. And it is very tempting to always be chasing the new thing, to always be looking for what's the beta release, and I got to get on that thing. And I understand why. We all want to be at the leading edge of our careers. But I think it's instructive to remember it's called the bleeding edge, not the have lots of fun and drink margaritas edge. It's the bleeding edge. And I think it's ironic that our industry is so obsessed with that. I mean, tell me some other line of work where you would be that obsessed with what's the latest and greatest type thing. I'll give you an example right out of my own life. I had my hip replaced last year. And I assure you, the first time I met my surgeon, if he would have said to me, "Oh, Nate, I'm so glad you came in today. Listen, I was just on Twitter and I read about this exciting new experimental hip replacement technique. Can I do it on you?" My answer would be to back slowly out of the room and find another surgeon. And yet in our line of work, we're constantly experimenting, constantly trying new things. And I do understand why. I mean, it is fun and it is a very important part of being in this industry. You realize pretty early on as a programmer that the most important skill you really have is your ability to learn new things. You're going to constantly be learning and picking up new technologies. And this is a vital skill. And I think, frankly, it speaks to how poorly we do at interviewing and trying to recruit talent. We lose sight of this. We get so caught up on this little checklist of items that we forget about the reality that whatever we're hiring you for today is probably not what you're going to be doing in 2 years. So can you grow? Can you learn new things? To me, that's a much more interesting question and will probably help us find a better fit when it is all said and done. It's also vitally important to remember that education is not something that ever finishes. This is actually a conversation I've had with my son. He's 13. Of course, he's experimenting with this whole learning from home thing, distance learning, whatever you want to call it. It seems to be going okay. I don't know. He disappears in his room for hours on end. I'm sure it's fine. But it's also key to know that our understanding goes through this sort of constant evolution. And there's a great Ben Evans thread on this. He talks about there's things where you've got strong opinions, and there's things where other people's opinion, and there's other things where I just don't have any opinion at all. And of course, for us, things are always moving in and out of those categories, and that's part of the challenge and part of the fun, frankly, of being in this industry. There's things you're just starting to play with. There's things you used to be an expert on, but that's all half forgotten at this point. There's things you don't follow anymore. And I used to do a lot of front end work. And so I used to know an awful lot about various JavaScript frameworks and haven't really been in that space now for probably 5 years. So I'm really not qualified anymore to give you advice on whether you should use Angular or whether you should use React or Vue or something else that's been invented in the last 6 months. Now, let's be very clear. If you've ever spent any time in the project room, you are abundantly aware of the fact that developers have opinions, and they're often very strong opinions. Does anyone want to debate tabs versus spaces today? I'm sure many of you have watched Silicon Valley. My wife and I used to watch that together before the series ended, and I'm sure you all remember the episode where the lead character breaks up with a wonderful woman over tabs versus spaces. And I don't remember who was on which side of the divide, and I don't really, frankly, have a strong opinion either way. But I about fell off the couch laughing because I thought this was so funny. And my wife, who's a business analyst and is in the other room so she can hear what I'm saying, so I have to be very careful. She didn't quite understand why it was funny. And so I attempted to explain it to her, and it got no funnier for her. I guess that's how this works. Now, I've had a lot of developers come up to me over the years and say, "Nate, we've got to use this technology." And I ask why, and they repeat the name of the technology to me. And it's vital to know there's a huge difference between the fact that just knowing the name doesn't really help you very much. We need to move beyond that. I do think in our industry, there's also a perhaps overblown fear of the old. I worked with this guy very early on in my career who had the retirement countdown screensaver going. And, it was a 4-digit number, I think, when I first started working with him. And so I was a little surprised that he was tracking it. Now that I'm closer to retirement than I was then, I kind of understand where he was coming from. But to no surprise, when that thing hit zero, a few days later, we had his going away party. But I was a little shocked to bump into him in the office probably 6 months later. And I said, "Hey, Dick, what are you doing here today? Did you come in to have lunch with somebody?" And he just kind of looked at me and said, "Oh, Nate, it's the darndest thing. They're paying me more than what I made before. And I'm only working like 3 days a week." I thought, well, that's great, you jackass. How do I get in on that? Like, I want to work less and get paid more. And of course, he had what would best be described as a legacy skill set. He knew COBOL and DB2 and Telon, and he knew where all the skeletons were buried because he put most of them in the code base. And he's able to take this old skill set and turn it into a very valuable contract. Now, I will admit that I very much identify with this. When a new technology or a new framework comes along, you tend to kind of poke holes in it and say, hang on a sec here. Isn't this just like that thing we tried once before? And I do think this is an important part of having experience in our industry. You can hear the echoes of the past. You can see how this is like that thing we tried to do and it didn't work before because of this constraint. Well, that constraint is gone now. Hey, maybe it'll work this time. That's part of what experience can give you. Now, I do think it's important to realize as well that we do seem to be deathly afraid of old. We don't want to have an old skill set. I have this theory that most of us early on in our career, someone kind of takes us under their wing and basically instructs us to always stay up to date with our skill set, that if we want or need to get a new job, we're able to do that. And so we seem to always, I guess, coat the old with this, it's impossibly arcane and complex, while the new is simple and elegant. When in reality, in many situations, well, it turns out the new thing is unfinished, buggy, and unproven, whereas the old stuff is refined, stable, and tested. And it's important to be able to make these distinctions. Now, if you were to come to me in your next Java project and say, Nate, we're not using JUnit. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Why not? And you said, well, because JUnit's old. And I don't know how old JUnit is off the top of my head. I'm pretty confident it can legally drink in every country on the planet. But that's not a good reason to kick it to the curb. Now, if you told me, well, I like this tool because it lets me do these things that JUnit can't do, okay, that's reasonable. But to simply say we're not using this because it's old, I mean, Java, I guess, could be qualified as old in technology terms. Now, I have noticed there's a very predictable hype cycle in our industry, and thank goodness my friend and colleague Kote made this tweet, and I immediately stole it. Year one, oh, this technology is radical. Year two, oh, this is really hard to use. Am I right? Year three, actually, you should never use this, especially if you're just trying to put like a web front end on a relational database. Ooh, look, something shiny and new. Rinse, repeat. Now, my only quibble with Kote's tweet, and I have told him this, is it's not measured in years. It's measured in months, maybe weeks in some cases. We have to be very, very aware of this because I've seen this again and again and again. And that, of course, takes me to one of my favorite questions to ask a developer when they're very excited about something is, all right, where should we not use that thing? And of course, the reality in this world is the way we learn where not to do something is trial and error. Look at whatever house or building you happen to be in right now. It's built out of materials that we as a species have used for millennia. And we've gotten better at it. I'm fairly confident if you went back to when we first started building structures, we probably weren't very good at it. There were probably a lot of integration errors. Somebody was telling me that when we first started building bridges, the master bridge builder was required to basically live on the bridge for a period of time as sort of like the final quality assurance step. And I think the person who was responsible for the arch would put in the last stone because if it failed, it would collapse and kill them. Well, look at your buildings. I mean, we have these things called building codes where we've literally taken a trial and error of hundreds of years of experience and said, this is how you have to build your house if you live in this part of the world. I live in Minnesota. It gets kind of chilly here in the winter. So the insulation requirements on our homes are different than if you're where Paul is in Texas. And so that's all part of this thing that we've taken that experience, we've codified it. We don't really have that in software because we're constantly being asked to build something that no one's ever built before using tools we just invented. And then people are like shocked that we can't give them an exact date when this is going to be done. Now, the best way I can describe this is by showing you a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. Now, I love Calvin and Hobbes. I grew up on Calvin and Hobbes, which made me delighted when my son then discovered Calvin, God, almost 10 years ago now. This is crazy how old we're all getting. And so I've now had the pleasure of basically rereading every Calvin and Hobbes cartoon probably 40 or 50 times, because for a number of years when I was home, my son would want me to read him some Calvin and Hobbes. And so I stumbled upon this one, or I should say I was reminded of this one, and it made it very clear to me that Watterson was ultimately a software engineer. We just didn't know it at the time. Well, how do they know the load limit on bridges, Dad? Well, they just drive bigger and bigger trucks over the bridge till the bridge breaks. Then they weigh the last truck and rebuild the bridge. Oh, should have guessed. This is what we do in software all the time. Is Mongo a good choice for this project? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Should we use Go on our next project? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Now, I do think it's important to understand that as developers, we usually have short attention spans. I don't know what's cause and effect here. I don't know if we get into this industry because we have short attention spans, or being in this industry gives us short attention spans. I have no idea, but we are kind of like dogs chasing squirrels. It's like, ooh, blockchain, oh, artificial intelligence. We just bounce back and forth because it's fun. Now, I will admit one of the advantages here is learning does keep it fresh. I was playing golf a few years ago with one of my friends, and he looked at me one day and said, Nate, don't you think you're at the point in your career where you need to get into management? And I was a little taken aback. I'm like, why would I need to do that? I like what I do. I don't want to be a manager. It's never been something I've yearned for. And he said, yeah, well, when I was about your age, I could do my job in my sleep, and it was really getting boring and redundant. And then I became a manager, and I was a force multiplier, and it really refreshed me for the second part of my career. And in having this conversation, I said, well, John, I think the difference here is I've never been able to do my job cold in my sleep because it's always a different job every couple of years. Now, of course, I have to balance that against the reality that I have to deliver business value. I have to get code into production. And I can't do that if I'm always experimenting with something, if we're always trying a new framework, always trying a new language. Eventually, we have to commit and we have to develop some expertise. If you want to be good at something, you have to repeat. You have to do it again and again and again and again. There are no shortcuts. I wish there was. That'd make life a lot easier. Now, it's important to remember that if you're on the bleeding edge, by implication, you're going to bleed. I was talking to somebody last summer, and they were complaining about some technology or another, doesn't matter which one it was. And I said, well, hang on, how long have you been using it? And he said, oh, about 6 months. I said, well, it just went 1.0 like 2 weeks ago. So you've been trying to put it in production when it was like 0.4, and you were surprised there were some rough edges? I mean, what did you expect? I realize that in many instances, our version numbers are kind of random number generators, but there is still a distinction usually between a 1.0 product and something that's less than 1.0. I love this tweet. Thank you for the latest version of your wonderful program. Breaking all my old code that worked is a great idea and provide me many hours of fun searching for a workaround. I actually had this experience with my personal website. I use Hugo to generate it, and I hadn't really touched my Hugo setup for a while. And then I made the mistake of upgrading without really thinking through what I was doing, and it completely broke my system to the point where I just had to nuke and pave my website and start all over again. That's the joy of working with sub 1.0 software. There's that old adage, how do you know who the pioneers are? Well, they're the ones with the arrows in their backs, and that's kind of the world we inhabit. We have to be aware of that, and frankly, we need to be strategic as senior technologists. We want to avoid dead platforms, but again, I can't constantly change direction. I can't be sort of this technology hummingbird flitting from one thing to another. So how do we be strategic? Well, first things first, hope is not a strategy. I'm sorry, it's just not how it works. The nicest thing I can say about hope is it's what rebellions are built on. That's as far as I can go. Now, that's great for rebellions but we need to be deliberate. Our customers need us to be deliberate. And one of the challenges we face is just the reality that there's a lot of bits out there. Every time I turn around, there's a new language, there's a new technique, there's a new approach. And it puts us into this challenging place where we have to keep up. And how do you do that? A lot of this depends on your own personal learning style and how you approach things. Maybe you like to read blogs, maybe you like to read books, follow people on Twitter, listen to podcasts, hang out on Twitch with us for an hour. But the moral of the story is there's always new things for us to play with. And I'm reminded of this conversation I had with one of my first managers. I was chatting with her one day and I said, Mary, why did you get out of technology? Why did you become a manager? And she said, well, Nate, I got tired of being on the technology merry-go-round. I got tired of having to constantly learn new things. And I didn't fully appreciate that at the time. I totally get it now. I don't think there are too many industries that throw away knowledge at quite the clip we do. The challenge for us is this needs to be a habit. This needs to be a routine for us. And it's going to vary from person to person. Maybe Friday afternoon is an open spot in your calendar. I'm very much of the opinion anyone who blocks a meeting with you on Friday afternoon has committed a hostile act. I just think that's wrong. I once had a manager try to set up an afternoon meeting with our team on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I thought, you got to be crazy. There's certain time periods that you just have to stay away from. Friday afternoon to me is one of those. Although ironically enough, I had a team meeting once that was like Friday at 4. It was just crazy. And it was even worse for our East Coast teammates because for them it was 5. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe you've got a sadistic manager. So maybe it's Tuesday over lunch. Maybe it's Monday morning. I don't know. Whatever fits for you and your schedule, but it has to be a habit. It has to be something that you block out. I'm a huge fan of morning coffee. And that's this basic concept that you take that first 15, 20, 30 minutes in the morning and you peruse the technical news with your favorite beverage of choice, coffee, espresso, a latte, a flat white, tea, energy drink, whatever makes you happy. And tech news can mean whatever it means to you. That can be catching up on Twitter, that can be checking out some new things on InfoQ, whatever makes you happy. But you do it first thing in the morning before your day gets away from you. If you wait, inevitably things are just going to blow up around you. We've all had that experience. You're on your way into work and you think, oh, today I'm finally going to get to, items A, B, and C on my list. And then contact with the enemy happens. And next thing you know, you're stumbling home and you're like, wow, I'm exhausted. I don't know what happened. I didn't even get remotely close to A, B, and C on my list. Very important to understand that attention is the most precious resource you have. And I'm genuinely thankful when people choose to give some of it to me when I'm giving a presentation. And it's a resource, friends. There's no way to scale it. Man, I wish there was. Then we actually would be able to find what the end of Netflix looks like. One of my all-time favorite quotes about attention is this one from Seth Godin. It's a bit like real estate. They're not making any more of it. Unlike real estate, though, the value of your attention keeps going up. Now, if you don't think your attention is valuable, then ask yourself why there are several multi-billion-dollar corporations that exist to capture and monetize your attention. Now, a lot of that is cat videos, clearly, and it's cat videos all the way down. That's my understanding of the internet these days. I ran into this post, I guess this was maybe 3 or 4 months ago, that was about people who said they weren't going to get a cat. And then here they are a year later and they have a cat. And like the second entry, it was this person who it was like, oh, here's my dad. He said he'd never have a cat. Now he's got a cat and the cat's on his lap and he's showing the cat videos. I thought, is like anything more meta than that? Like it's a cat watching cat videos. It's just cats all the way down. So don't waste your attention, please. You need to be selective. You cannot, in fact, read it all. I am so sorry. In fact, you're probably going to miss almost everything that gets produced. Now, I've struggled with this throughout my life. I used to subscribe to a lot of magazines. For those of you that are on the younger end of the spectrum, magazines are like the internet, except printed out and sent to your home on some cadence. And I've let almost all my subscriptions lapse because I'm just not reading them. I have all these other things that are clamoring for my attention. And there was one magazine in particular that I've subscribed to for, I think, almost 20 years. And when like the third renewal notice came in, my wife's like, are you sure? And I'm like, it's good. I've got a year's worth of them right there. I think I'm fine. If I haven't taken the time to read it in a year, I'm clearly not going to. Now, the challenge here is I think a lot of us have that sort of fear of missing out on something. And I'm here to tell you if it's a big enough deal, it will bubble up into your consciousness, even if you don't want it to. And I can give you plenty of examples of that. I'm going to try to stay away from it because I'm trying not to think about the news right now, but it will bubble into your consciousness. We can't adopt everything. Sorry. This is the reality of the world we live in. Heat death of the universe will happen before you can adopt every possible technology out there. And so that puts us in that sort of strange conundrum of like, how do we know where to invest our time? How do we know where we should be spending this precious resource? Some people will tell you, well, it's just an instinct you have. Just follow your gut. And so Paul Graham wrote this piece many years ago about the hacker's radar. And Paul is a very smart person. He's been a very successful entrepreneur. He's backed a number of very successful companies. So he clearly knows a thing or two about our space. And so he wrote this piece and laid out a lot of very good criteria, by the way, of things that he looks at when a new language comes along. And throughout this piece, at the end of it, he basically is talking about Java. And he says, you know what, I don't think Java is going to be very successful. Now, in his defense, we sit here in 2020 with the value of 2020 vision in the past. We can say, well, how could he have missed that one? But, at the time, I can see where you could make an argument. But right now, I mean, Java is clearly one of the most successful languages of all time. We can have a very fun debate about where it is in the top 5 most successful languages of all time. But, having never written a line of Java, glancing at a few books, Paul wasn't able to come to what I would argue is the right conclusion about Java. So maybe a hunch isn't enough for most of us. Now, I will say that judging covers can be a very useful filter. Let me give you an example. I had a friend at my previous company who got really into this sort of drag and drop WYSIWYG tool. And I was a little apprehensive about it for many reasons. Probably one being when we had our first training on it, the company's trainer got up and told us, and the best thing about our product is you don't need any programmers. And he said this to a room full of programmers. I thought, okay, you're already losing your audience, and it's the first 5 minutes of your presentation. Well played, sir. Now, my friend, though, thought this was amazing, thought it was awesome. And so I was talking to him one day and I said, all right, well, hang on a second. How do you test this stuff? And he said, oh, well, that's the best part about it. You don't need to test because it's all the guardrails in place make sure you can't do anything bad. I said, okay, well, that seems a little sketchy. And I said, well, how do you do a diff? It's this drag and drop WYSIWYG thing. And he said, oh, well, I guess I could print out a screenshot and I could do a visual comparison. And I'm like, all right, we're done here. I don't need to know anything more about this. Am I the only one hearing things in the background now? Is that just me?
Oh,
It's all Paul's fault. When in doubt, blame the Australian.
he's
That's
the
what
only
I
one
always
who's
say.
not muted besides you. So
Okay. All right.
There it is. And now, of course, he can't hear you because he's
Well,
being
I bet
talked to.
if you're the host, you can probably just mute him on our
Oh,
behalf.
yeah. Let's see here.
go,
Boop.
Bob.
Power.
Go, Bob.
Oh,
Yeah.
the magic.
See, the
system
system works.
Jinx.
Yes. So we need to be very aware of bias, though. Every one of us has had a negative experience with JavaScript at some point in our career, and it's very easy to just sort of paint JavaScript with this very negative sort of connotation. The language has improved considerably since it was first, birthed. So we have to watch out that one negative experience doesn't sort of unfortunately taint all of our future thoughts about that. We need to think a bit about where the community is as well, although we have to be very aware of the lemming effect. It's very easy to sort of jive off the cliff because, well, that's what everybody else is doing. And of course, I can say this living in the state of hockey, but are you skating to where the puck was? I've seen that way too often. Well, we have to do this because that's what's next in the order. Well, you can skip steps from time to time. That's okay. Now, I'm a huge fan of the technology radar. This is an artifact that comes out of ThoughtWorks periodically. Every time a new one comes out, there's usually at least 1 or 2 things I'm like, oh, I wasn't even aware of that. I didn't realize that it had matured to this point where I should be taking another look at it. So this has been a very useful tool for me to use over my career. I'm very bummed that Google's 20% time never really took off, and I realize that it's kind of fallen out of favor. But this idea of giving developers some time, ideally every week to scratch an itch, to try things, to play, to me is just a fantastic relief valve. So, oh, you want to try that fancy schmancy new language or tech stack or database or whatever it happens to be? Great. Do it on your side project. And if it doesn't work out, well, just your side project. If it turns out that's really useful, awesome. We've learned something very, very valuable. Now, maybe, 20% of the time is never going to happen in your company because, what manager is going to sign off on giving developers a day a week? Well, maybe it's Innovation Friday. And it doesn't have to be every Friday. It could be every other Friday or the first Friday of the month or every other month or whatever cadence you can possibly squeeze in. And if a whole Friday is too much, maybe we just start with a Friday afternoon and just say, okay, well, let's take that dead spot anyway and give people a chance to play and try some things out and learn about what might or might not be useful for us. Now, if even that's too much, I strongly advise you to take a look at like a Tech Talk Tuesday concept, kind of like what we're doing here. Basically give people an opportunity to go learn and then present about what they learned to other people. And you can model this off what my friend calls an architectural briefing, which basically says one person goes and does some research and then presents it back to the team. I do want to stress you do not, in fact, need to be an architect to do one of these. Why should we use this thing? What do you need to know in order to answer the why? What do you need to know in order to use this thing? Now, I recommend these be relatively short, 45-ish minutes. This is not the deep dive how to, but we do want to get beyond kind of hello world initial documentation. And it's important that these be participatory events. This should be two-way traffic. Attendees should be taking notes. Most importantly, they should be asking questions. They should be bringing their own experiences to the party saying, well, I did something like this before and it suffered from this and this. Is this going to have the same problem? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Why not? And by the way, you should do one of these in the future as well. Now, if we get past the briefing filter, well, let's roll up our sleeves. Let's get our hands dirty. Let's do a little hands on time and let's workshop it. You are never going to have enough time here. Give yourself a couple of hours, a couple of days, as much as you can possibly make sense of. And I had somebody ask me last summer, should I use Angular or React? And after giving them the exact knowledge that I'm really not an expert on this, I said, well, the best thing you could do is build the app in React and then build the app again in Angular and then throw away the one you don't like. Now, no one's ever going to give you the time to do that. So you have to be very hyper focused on what are the important use cases for us. What are the things we have to prove given this undoubtedly shorter time frame than we want. So you get through a few exercises, you get through kind of the setup stuff so that it's easy for people just to get in and start learning and playing. Now, if we get past the hands-on filter, well, let's look for something in the organization that we can try it on. And this should be a real project where it's a good fit. This should not be a little duct tape and baling twine. This is a good idea. Please don't do that. And this is not generally advised on the bet the company project. Now, if you're a startup and you've got 6 weeks of runway, probably doesn't matter, roll the dice. Most of us really is not advisable to try the experimental thing on whatever the key money-making application is in the organization. Now, as much as we get fixated on the new, we have to be very aware of currency. You look at the kind of bugs that we're seeing in the wild today, you look at the kind of hacks that are happening. Equifax hack caught a lot of people, opened a lot of people's eyes because it had such a huge ripple out effect and affected so many people. Although clearly we haven't learned from that. That software is still living apparently in production in some organizations. It seems like on a regular basis, we get news about yet another biggest hack ever, yet another biggest hack ever. That seems to be a pretty recurring theme here. And I've had a lot of people tell me, you're not really a target. Well, it turns out we're all kind of targets. And they took down the interactive map, which is unfortunate, but I just loved watching these sort of real live, in time attacks happening. And, it really kind of helps you wake up when you don't have access to espresso just to see how constant these attacks are. And this reality is changing the way companies think about security. And it gets us to this notion of rotate, repave, repair. For years, production support options were, hey, just pour concrete over it, don't change anything ever. And then it turns out, actually, if you want to stay safe today, you need to move fast. Speed reduces risk because it starves our adversaries of the resources they need to attack us. Now, to be honest, technology has changed to allow this. we have customers that nuke and pave their data center on a regular basis. I talking to a friend of mine, he told me in their organization, it's just standard operating procedure to destroy and recreate app instances, I think hourly, because their expectation is if somebody gets in, they only have an hour. How far can they get in an hour? So as senior technologists, we better be thinking about our patching strategy. We better be thinking about what needs to change in our organization in order to keep moving things forward. And it's very easy typically to say, well, what version of a thing are we on? It's very difficult to say, is that the version we want to be on and how are we going to get there? Now, a lot of companies, including some that I've worked for, have an N or N minus one policy. It's easy to have a policy. It's much harder to measure it. It's even harder to enforce it. I did an architecture review several summers ago, and I was walking through it with the lead architect, and I asked a very typical question. I said, "Hey, what version of that JavaScript framework are you using?" And he told me, "Oh, 4.3." And he said, "Congratulations, I have to mark you yellow." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because that's now N minus two. Sorry." And he said, "Well, when did the new version come out?" I said, "About 2 months ago." I sent out several emails on that. And he said, "Oh, okay, well, bummer." Now, I didn't have the power to stop them from going to production, even though I was the quote unquote reviewing architect. All I could do was say, "Hey, you've got this problem. You need to remediate it." For all I know, that's still running in production today, and they never changed it. I don't know. That's a cultural thing. And I know how hard it is to change culture. But what would you rather do? Change your culture or be the next largest hack ever? Now, as senior technologists, we need to think long and hard about the pros and the cons because every single technical choice you make involves trade offs. When someone comes to you and says, "This is the most amazing thing ever," you need to look for the trade offs. What are the trade offs? This is design in a nutshell. This is architecture in a nutshell. Now, of course, the challenge for us is we can always say, on the other hand, and sort of paraphrase Harry Truman, please, someone give me a one handed technologist. So, should I use React or Angular? Should we refactor to microservices? Should we be on-prem or public cloud? Now, there are three answers to every question you've ever gotten in computer science. There's 42. That's the geek check to see who's well read. As an architect, my all-time favorite answer is another layer of indirection. But the answer that I have to give more often than not is, well, it depends. Now, a lot of people get very mad at me when I say it depends because they feel it's a cop out. I never mean this as a way of ending the conversation. I mean it as a way of beginning the conversation. You have to tell me more about your environment. Tell me what's going on. And to be very clear, in many, many cases, these aren't or decisions, they're and decisions. We're going to use this and that. And that's one of the hardest things about being an architect. That's this balancing these opposing forces, keeping them in the proper tension. How do we get these constraints, bent in the direction that we need it to be? There is no such thing as a perfect technology. I'm sorry. Don't ever pretend there is. The first thing you need to be able to do is acknowledge the negatives. So if you come to me with a new technology, there's a couple questions I'm going to ask you right out of the gate. What do you like about it? Now, this should be pretty easy for you to answer. And I'm going to let you in a little secret. I don't really care what you say here. I mean, I do care because I'm a technologist and I'm a geek. And so I'm very curious to see what you think. But it's my follow-up question that I'm much more interested in, which is what don't you like about it? You better have some answers to this. If you're just sort of like, "Oh, no, it's great. I love it. Would not change anything." You haven't worked with it long enough. You don't know where the edges of the map are. You don't know where the dragons live. One of my favorite ways to pull this out of people in an interview, they come in, they're an expert on something, or they've been using something for 3, 4, 5 years. I say, "Okay, cool. I'm going to put you in charge of that project. Your word is law. You can add any feature you want, but you have to remove something first. What would you do?" This is a hard question for a lot of us to answer. It's very easy to come up with a thing you would add. It's very hard to come up with a thing that you would remove. And I can tell you, when you find a good answer to this, it's usually someone that you don't let leave the building until you've extended them a job offer. At least that's been my experience with this particular set of questioning. I love this Kelsey tweet. Kelsey's got a lot of great ones. This is one of my all-time favorites. You haven't mastered a tool until you understand where it should not be used. So key. It's so easy for us to say, I'm going to sprinkle some of this technology on the problem. That's going to solve all my woes. And it's just not how it works. The challenge for us is knowing when not to use this thing. My wife and I had our basement finished last year. And of course, what I mean by that is we wrote checks to other people because I'm a software person. I don't know anything about hardware. And so asking me to do a hardware project is not going to end well. And I wanted this to be done sometime in my lifetime with a reasonable level of quality. And so the folks that came and did that work, they didn't just show up with one hammer. They had a truck full of hammers, and they knew when to use which one. So that's part of the challenge for us, is knowing, this is the right place for a sledgehammer, and this is the right place for a finishing hammer, and this is the right place for a roofing hammer. And that's the challenge. So how does it stack up to the alternatives? Well, we could use a spreadsheet. That's not the worst thing we can do. You can put your options across the top. You put your criteria down the left. Certainly weight the criteria to your heart's content. Now, then you get into the problem of, well, how do I do my scale? A lot of people say, 1 through 5. Cool. Which one's good? Which one's bad? Does not matter how many times you say 1 is good, 5 is bad, or vice versa. Someone reading your evaluation is going to invert your criteria. Sorry. Nature of the beast. That's one of the reasons why I love Harvey balls. That's these guys. Basically says, I'm not filled in. I'm all the way filled in. I'm somewhere in between. This tends to be a little less ambiguous than 1 through 5. But we're just trying to get to how closely does this map to the criteria. I have found this to be very effective. So I did an evaluation a while back on sort of Angular versus React. These are some of the criteria that I look at. Now, I want to stress, I can move any one of these a quarter point and lose 0 sleep. I want to stress that you could do the exact same evaluation I did, using the exact same criteria I did, and come to a different conclusion than I did. There is no magic formula here. It's an awful lot like, if you remember that wonderful scene from Dead Poet Society, where he says, let's turn to the beginning of the book and let's rip out the part where we can judge a poem by its, importance and something else. And, so these are by definition subjective. And the interesting thing to me is, even after having gone through and done this evaluation, I personally prefer React a bit to Angular. And it's no one thing. They're both fine. They both get the job done. Plenty of people I know use both. Plenty of people I know love one over the other. That's great. The challenge for us is trying to figure out, which criteria should I use? What's important to me in this situation, and how should I weight them? Well, guess what? That's up to you. I've done a lot of these evaluations in my career. I've never once had somebody say, here, this is how I want you to do it. They just look at you and say, well, you're the smart technology person, figure it out. Now, it is very easy to tip the scales. It's very tempting to take your thumb and apply it firmly to the scale. That almost always backfires. Be very, very cautious here. Now, as architects, as senior technologists, one of the things that we need to spend a fair amount of our time thinking about is quality attributes. Now, I grew up calling these non-functional requirements, and I was having this conversation with one of my peers several years ago, and he kept calling them quality attributes. And I finally said, "Oh, hang on a sec here, Mark. You keep calling these quality attributes. I was taught they're non-functional requirements. Why aren't you using that term?" And he said, "Well, think about it, Nate. You're in a conversation with your customer, and you say non-functional. Your customer stops listening as soon as they hear the word non. They're like, I don't want any of that non stuff. I want features and functionality. That's where their focus is at." Now, some people call these quality goals, constraints, quality of service goals, cross-functional requirements, the architecturally significant requirements, otherwise known as availities. Now, to be clear, our customers focus on functionality. Makes perfect sense. It's what they see. It's important. It's obvious that we have to get that right. But as senior technologists, we have to look beyond that. We have to see the big picture. We have to see the forest. We have to say, all right, what quality attributes matter most for this particular problem domain? You might call these service level objectives, if you will, same basic idea. And there's literally almost a limitless list of them. Now, many of them, though not all, end in ility. I've never had a developer say, I wish this code was harder to maintain. In cloud environments, we tend to talk an awful lot about scaling. You better care about reliability today, and you better think about security. It's important for a lot of us that our code be easy to deploy. I wish more people in our industry cared about simplicity. I think we sort of fetishize complexity, unfortunately. I'm a longtime front-end person, so I care a lot about usability. I wish more apps thought about usability. I've had plenty of wonderful experiences with unusable applications in my career. Care about compatibility, fault tolerance, modularity. The list goes on and on and on. Now, what quality attributes do you care most about? Depends an awful lot on types of systems that you're building. It depends on the kind of software that you're writing. One of my grad students did a presentation for class last week talking about this little Raspberry Pi device that he's using to keep track of the solar panels at his cabin to see how much uh, power is being used in any given moment in his cabin by the toaster and the TV and things like that. And very interesting set of constraints that are around software that he's writing for that, because you can't just throw more hardware at it. It's these little tiny devices, and how big are the packets and how frequently are those packets happening. It's a very interesting set of domains. I've written a lot of enterprise web applications. And so for a lot of the problems we ran into, it's like, well, throw more hardware at the problem. If you're doing small embedded type things like one of my students, you don't have that luxury. It's a sort of Internet of Things concept where they are small, cheap devices. You can't just add more RAM or add more CPU. Of course, the challenge for us, of course, is we don't get to turn all the knobs to 11, because so many of these actually have inverse relationships. And by definition, if I maximize one, I've minimized another. So if you think about security and usability, I remember this time where my friends and I used to spend countless hours on airplanes. And every so often, a report would come out saying, oh, the TSA missed X% of banned items. And I never really lost any sleep over that, because to be clear, most people are getting on an airplane. They don't have malintent. And of course, you could create a security process that made sure nothing bad ever got through, but you would never fly because it would be so invasive. You'd have to show up to the airport a couple days in advance. You'd basically submitting to what would best be described as a medical procedure, and you just wouldn't do it. And so the challenge here is it's a balance for us. We have to find that balance and figure out how to get those forces in the right tension. Now, of course, part of what makes this challenging is some of the things we're trying to do are very obvious. If the system can't handle the number of concurrent requests we have, the customers are going to figure that out. Again, things like Heartbleed, things like the Equifax hack have made it a lot easier for us to have these conversations with our customers about the importance of some of these. So it's fairly easy to convince them of the importance of some of these quality attributes. However, there's a number of them that are invisible, or at least they're very difficult for our customers to see. So think about maintainability and simplicity. We obviously know why maintainability matters. We can make the case for simplicity, but how do I have that conversation with my customer? So I used to own a car that had a secondary battery, and I didn't even realize that was a thing until I brought it in for like an oil change, and they said, oh, by the way, we need to replace your secondary battery because there's a lot of electronic gizmos on cars now, so they need extra juice. I said, oh, okay, well, how much is that? And he says, oh, the battery's only like $90. I thought, well, wow, that's not so bad. And he said, well, yeah, but here's the catch. It's 4 hours of labor because we have to take the passenger seat out because that's where the battery lives. It's like, oh, cool. So from my standpoint, I kind of wish it was easier to maintain because it would have saved me some money. Of course, by the same token, I'm not the one who's actually doing the work, so maybe I don't care that much. But how do we make the argument for some of that? How do we get our decision makers to buy into some of these? And this is where we have to practice one of the most important things in an architect's toolkit, and that's influence. If you can't influence other people as an architect, it's very difficult to be successful. So I never was taught how to do this in computer science 101. This is not something that was covered in my computer science undergraduate degree, nor in my software engineering graduate program. It's not something that comes naturally to many of us either, by the way. So what we can do is outline the benefits. We can look for common ground. I strongly advise you to avoid aggression. It's very easy in these conversations to basically fall back on I'm smart, do what I say because I'm smart. You need to listen. This is hard, but you have to put on your listening hat and be ready to have a conversation. And let's be abundantly clear, it is difficult to convince people. If you've ever been in a relationship with another human being, you know how hard it is to convince them to do something differently. There's two basic approaches here. There's the hammer, I'm going to order you to do something, and there's the ninja. I'm going to convince you it's your idea. I'll tell you two stories to kind of hammer this point home. The first one involves my son. When he was younger, the daycare center that we took him to had a standing rule: thou shalt wash your hands before being released into general population. And so we'd get there, be early in the morning. I would have had zero espresso at this point in the day. And I would say to my then 3-year-old son, hey, buddy, please go wash your hands. And anyone who's ever raised a child knows what happens next. He would just sort of look at me and say, no. Now, I don't have a particularly deep parenting toolkit. And so I'd say it a little louder in case he didn't hear me. I'd remind him of our relationship status in case he forgot overnight. I'd say, Everett, I'm your father. Go wash your hands. To which he would just say, no, never. Cross his little arms and look at me. Now, I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to deploy the foot. And this is where my wife steps in, proving she's way better at this whole parenting thing. And she'd just say, hey, buddy, I bet I can get my hands washed before you can. She takes one step towards the sink and he runs over, starts washing his hands. Ha ha, mommy, I beat you. Yes. Yes, you did. I'll tell you another story also involving my family. I was home, this is probably 6 months ago, and my wife had made vegetarian quesadillas for dinner. And I made a comment like, didn't we just had vegetarian quesadillas not that long ago? And she said, well, yeah, you come up with a vegetarian meal then. And I said, what do you mean? She said, yeah, at least once a week I make a no meat meal. And both my son and I kind of looked at her like, well, how long has this been going on? She said, about a year. And I'm like, oh, I didn't notice that. Now, I assure you, had my wife made this plan clear, my son in particular would have pushed back rather aggressively on that. But it has been very interesting now that we're aware of how she's manipulating our diet, that we've become a little more engaged in that process. She actually makes a very good, essentially like it's a buttered chickpea dish. It's very tasty. So how do we deal with this in an organization? Well, we got to look for the influencers. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the org chart. That isn't going to always tell you the answers here. You look for that person who's clearly influential and you influence them. You'll know who they are. They tend to kind of stand out. Like I had this one person I used to work with who I knew he was influential because I was talking to him one day and I said, hey, what you been working on? He said, oh, I've been flying drones. I said, what? He said, yeah, I've been flying drones for the last couple of months trying to see if they're useful for the claims guys. I'm like, huh, well, that's cool. I'd like to get paid to fly drones for a while. Approach as equals, rely on the strength of your idea, the strength of your reputation. By the way, your reputation speaks for you when you're not in the room. And if you're not sure what your reputation is, you should ask. You might not like the answer, by the way, but that's the only way you can actually change it. At some point in my career, I had gotten the reputation in my org as being the crazy open source guy. And I don't really think of that as a bad thing, but clearly some of the directors in my company at the time did think it was kind of a negative. And so a couple of years later, I asked my manager, do I still have that rep? And he said, well, I don't know, I'll find out. Came back to me a few days later, he says, no, you've pretty much shed that one. And I'm not really sure what I did, honestly, to either earn it or get rid of it, other than be a proponent of open source stuff. But, you know, the joy of enterprise IT. Try to find common ground, look for ways of dealing with some reciprocity, be helpful, be respectful, make sure you've researched your ideas, that you're using trusted sources. Don't be afraid to recruit credible allies. There's nothing wrong with bringing help to the party. It's also key for us to speak their language. You know, in our industry, we get down in the weeds of technobabble a lot and we love to throw around jargon. It's kind of how I know who's in the tribe and who's not in the tribe. But you know what? Our customers don't care. You know, for most people in the world, spring isn't a Java framework, it's a season. And depending on, I guess, which clock you believe in, we're in spring right now. So you got to ask yourself, like, what resonates in your organization? Is it all about cost savings, developer productivity, speed to market? And go ahead and shape your message accordingly. All right, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here for the sake of time. So one of the things that I figured out very early on in my career as an architect is I can't, in fact, be everywhere at all times. I can't be involved in every decision. I have to empower my teams to make good decisions when I'm not in the room. So how do I do that? Well, I need to establish principles or guardrails or guideposts or North Stars, whatever you want to call it. But it boils down to I need to create an environment within which my projects can thrive. Of course, the challenge here is, well, how do I know if people are actually doing what I'm asking them to do? How do I know if they're following these principles that we laid out? You know, as architects, we spend this time and energy coming up with a good architectural solution. We tend not to think very much about how to test that. And that's where the idea of fitness functions to me is so key. Now, everybody is familiar with the second law of thermodynamics, otherwise known as the teenager's bedroom. Earlier this year, I had to, I think, put something in my son's room, and I had a hard time kind of figuring out where the floor was. And I made a comment to my wife that I should probably ask the kid to clean his room. And she just kind of looked at me and said, "What hill do you want to die on today?" And I thought, apparently not that one. I guess we'll just let that one go by. The moral of the story is the universe wants to be disordered. There's just no getting around that. Software, of course, is not immune from this either. I mean, every one of us has started a new project and said something along the lines of, this time we're going to do it right. And then 3 months later, 6 months later, we've crossed the streams and, we're tearing out our hair going, what idiot wrote this? Oh, wait, it was me from 2 months ago. We go through all this effort to establish an architecture. We don't think very long about how to maintain it. Now, I can't possibly spend every minute of every day on every project. Every organization I've been around, architects are spread thin. I used to think that we didn't have very good architects in my organization because you wouldn't see them very often. It seemed like about once every 2 weeks, you might get an hour with your architect. And then I became an architect and had like 30 projects dropped on my head the next day and went, I see what's going on here. So how do I ensure teams are making good decisions if I'm not around? How do I deal with that? Now, of course, I can't predict the future. I mean, the only thing I can do, I guess, is study history. That's about as close as we can get here. Of course, I guess that's not entirely true, right? There is one thing we know for a fact is going to happen in our industry, and that's that stuff will change, which of course puts us into this interesting bind because we typically talk about architecture as the decisions that are hard to change or the decisions we wish we'd gotten right. But how do I square this circle? I know things are going to change. Isn't this sort of anti agile? Which I think is a very contributing factor to the whole we're agile, we don't have architects theory, which I've always found kind of hilarious because, of course, you have people making architectural decisions. It doesn't matter what their title is, doesn't matter what their role is. I hope for your sake they're making good ones. Don't worry, you'll know in a year or two. The person who told me my app has 4 different UI frameworks freely admitted we don't have architects at my company. That's why I'm here. I'm trying to learn how to be an architect. And I thought, okay, I see what's happening here. The first one, obviously, I get it. The second one, sure, we want to make some changes. But the third one is when somebody should have stood up and said, hang on. And by the fourth one, someone should have literally flipped a table. So what do we do about that? Well, maybe we change our assumptions. Maybe we listen to Martin. He's a pretty smart guy. Let's build for now. Let's choose technology that can evolve, and let's evolve one use case at a time. What if we built our architectures expecting things to change? That's sort of the core central tenet of building evolutionary architectures. An evolutionary architecture supports guided incremental change. Guided incremental change. That's what we're striving for here. Now, of course, some architectures are more evolvable than others. You've all been involved with some kind of an application that looked a little bit like this. There's a reason they're referred to as Death Star architectures. So maybe we need to change how we do things. We deploy components. We use feature toggles as a way of turning things on or off. We now can change incrementally, and we can actually perform hypothesis-driven development. But how do I know if my architecture still meets our needs? How do I know if some feature, some refactoring didn't break some vital part of our architecture? Well, that's where this concept of fitness functions comes from. And I'm very much of the opinion this is one of the most important things to be discussed in our industry in a long time. And this comes right out of evolutionary computing, which is let's take this algorithm and let's mutate it. And then ask ourselves, is that mutation a success? Are we closer to or further from our goal? And of course, for architecture, this is all about protecting the ilities and balancing those trade offs. One of the things I love about fitness functions is they give us a great way of capturing and preserving those key architectural characteristics, which of course means we have to think about them first. We have to identify them. You can call these service level indicators if you want. So, what can we measure? Now, be careful here. Sometimes we let the thing we can measure dictate far too much. Just because we can measure it does not, in fact, means it matters. Every one of you at some point has had some manager say, let's look at numbers of lines of code as a way of evaluating you in some way, shape, or form. Once we have a metric, we can start to set some goals. We might call these service level objectives, if you will, which, by the way, is not the same thing as a service level agreement. The A turns out to be very important. Now I can create a fitness function. which is essentially just a test that I execute to validate our architecture. How close does this particular design get us to our objectives? Now, in a perfect world, this is all automated, but sadly, some things still require manual verification. So let me give you some examples. We might decide that all our service calls must respond within an average of 100 milliseconds. We might decide that cyclomatic complexity shall not exceed a small single-digit number. Cyclomatic complexity, by the way, for those of you that are unfamiliar, is just how many paths are there through my code base. Probably don't want to have any cyclic dependencies. That would be bad. We might have some new developers who aren't up to speed on directionality of imports. And so we might write a test that says, you know what, it's totally fine if persistence and web include util. But if somebody were to go the other direction and somehow include web into util, well, we're going to go ahead and break the build. With all these APIs that we're creating today, we may not always be aware of all of the people who are calling it. And so consumer-driven contracts can help us mutate the underlying functionality. As long as we don't break that contract, we're not breaking our consumers. Spring Cloud Contract can help with this as well. There is a tool called ArcUnit that we can actually use to test our architecture. I think that's very cool. There is a .NET version as well. There's several other tools that are starting to come online in this space as well. You might look at performance. You might say, I want to care about the average and maximum response times. We might look at the average response time as we scale up the number of users, or the number of requests. We might look at the number of timeouts and application faults. I had students a couple years ago who were very interested in knowing when they tipped over to the next pricing tier with their cloud provider. We might decide that if there's a hard failure of an application, our platform will spin up a new instance. On and on and on. Now, obviously, we want to alert when things go out of band, but these are the kinds of tests that we want to write to make sure that this doesn't happen in production. Now, as much as I'd like to say you're going to know everything beforehand, you probably aren't. That's when we're going to have to unleash the simian army in some way, shape, or form on our code base. A little bit of chaos engineering can be your friend. Well, I'm at about an hour. I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I think that's probably sufficient for our needs. And so as you can see, that's how you get through Jedi Fallen Order.
Oh, wow. That was what that was.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. Hard to believe. Yep. Very important. I'll be the first to admit I have watched some of the playthroughs because it's hard to know how they get past certain parts, certain levels.
Sure. That's when you need a guide.
For me, that's my 13-year-old.
Yeah.
So that's how that works, because.
Yep.
I can't
time to dedicate.
I was going to say, I cannot devote nearly as much time to it as he can. He was giving me grief one day. I was playing and he was watching and he's like, oh, you're not very good at fighting. And I'm like, what? He's like, your style's just way off. And I'm like, I can't devote 40 hours a week to mastering, the lightsaber maneuvers here, friend. So.
Yeah, these are priorities.
It's a good point. I mean, we're all in virus lockdown anyways. Now I do. Now I guess I do have the time. I'm not getting on airplanes.
Boom, roasted yourself.
I'm so sorry. I should have seen that coming. Totally fine. And checks out. Fantastic. Thank you.
That's right.
Thank you.
And thankfully, we didn't get to see the video call for that because that would have.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's not. Some things once seen cannot be unseen.
No, there's not enough. I can't even say this joke because of things.
Right. Anyway, we can't anymore. I know where you're going.
Yep.
Can't even go there anymore. It's ruined for all of us.
Hey, Tanzu Tuesdays, everybody. We did one.
Yeah.
We're not at 116, but 5, huh? Boom. Wait, 4? 4. Get ahead of myself.
I have 4.
That's right. 4.
So it's like ER episodes. There's like 331 of those.
Yeah.
We started going through that as a family, and I think we're on the 3rd season now, and it's really depressing when you do the math and you're like,
oh, you got a lot more to go.
Got a lot to go.
But really, I mean, after George Clooney leaves, are there any more episodes?
No,
I mean,
it ends there.
It's just them going blah 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 blah.
Drama.
Yeah. Do you like how I just completely discredited all those actors' hard work, like their careers?
Got it.
No. It's just another show that started. It's good. It's very good. It's good. Well, speaking of our 5th episode, that's next week with our dear friend Paul Tchaikovsky-Golievsky.
Oh,
Who-
Nice.
Yeah. So why don't you give us a little preview? What are we going to hear about next week? And are you just going to like laissez-faire, swing back and forth in your chair like that while you're walking us others? Look at me, everybody. I'm going to build this helm chart and be completely relaxed while doing it. Hopefully my proctologist doesn't call me during the middle of it. Yeah, you're gonna have to turn your phone on mute, my friend.
I have to take this call live.
That's
Might
probably
have to.
best. It's for the best.
Sure.
Definitely not confusing at all. Well, I want to thank everyone again for paying attention and listening to our very good friend Nate Schutta. As always, shout out to the Java Grunts, the B McLeans, Sweet Killer 9. Nice to see you. It's a great name. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's just the evolution. It's
Right.
one better.
Right. Right.
And,
Does that mean there's a Sweet Killer 11?
Who knows? I mean,
Is it taken?
Only one way to find out.
That's right.
All right, my friends. Take care of yourselves.
Hey, guess what?
Yes.
I had myself muted still in OBS, so people could not hear me.
Oh, they couldn't hear anything.
Check.
Okay.
Couldn't hear anything.
Out. There's
So,
a GDP right there.
I'm so great at this game.
Yep.
I had to unmute myself in 3 places, and I only did it in 2.
Well played.
Well, why don't you give us another brief what you're doing, because they didn't get to hear it.
Boy, all right. So next Tuesday we will be talking about we'll be deploying some Spring applications with Helm charts. So we'll probably just like start from a completely blank slate and create a brand new Helm chart, and we'll deploy probably the Spring Pet Clinic unless somebody has a better idea. So if someone wants a very specific Spring app, hit me up either in the stream chat or find me on Twitter or something. Otherwise, we'll roll with the Spring Pet Clinic.
Word. Excellent. Well, all right. Nate, you're a gentleman and a scholar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. Good seeing you as always.
Yep, you as well. And hopefully it can be IRL sooner than later.
Oh, can't wait.
All right. Take care, all you Tanzu Tuesdaysians. I'll work on it.
We'll workshop it.
You have time. You have a week.